On September 3, 1929, the American stock market reached the highest point in its history. Ordinary people, barbers, teachers, chauffeurs, had poured their savings into stocks, many of them on borrowed money because everyone knew the market only went up. 34 months later, it had lost 89% of its value. 9,000 banks failed, and there was no deposit insurance, none. When your bank died, your money died with it. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers had no job. A third of the country's farmers lost their land. We've told you how the richest families in America lost their fortunes. This time, the story is about everyone else. Because the most useful question in financial history isn't how the Vanderbilts went broke. It's how a farmhand with 3 children and no savings made it through the worst decade in American economic history, alive. This is how ordinary people survived 1929. Here's what you'll learn from them up front. The people who made it through didn't survive on money. Most of them had none within a year or two. They survived on 4 things: skills that other people needed, networks of neighbors who traded and shared, brutal flexibility about pride, and small stores of real things, food, tools, land, that no bank failure could erase. And one more thing, the one nobody likes to hear. Some people got richer in the Depression than they had ever been. Not by luck, by doing the exact opposite of the crowd, years before the crash. We'll meet them too. But first, you need to understand what actually vanished, because it wasn't just stock prices. The 1920s taught Americans a new religion, the market. For the first time, ordinary people could buy stocks on margin. Put down $10, borrow $90, own $100 of stock. As long as prices rose, it was magic. And prices rose for nearly a decade. By 1929, the fever had a priesthood. Economists, bankers, and newspapers assured the public that something fundamental had changed, that the old cycle of boom and bust had been repealed. Days before the crash, Irving Fisher, the most famous economist in America, declared that stock prices had reached a permanently high plateau. People believed him because they wanted to, and because every previous doubter had been proven wrong by another year of rising prices. That's the anatomy of every bubble in history. The smartest people in the room explaining why this time is different. The peak came on September 3, 1929, the Dow Jones at 381. Then, in late October, the floor gave way. Black Thursday, Black Monday, Black Tuesday. Margin loans were called in, and the $10 investors were wiped out first, their entire stake gone before the crash was even a week old. Here's what the movies get wrong. There was no wave of ruined bankers jumping from windows in 1929. The chief medical examiner of New York counted the suicides that autumn and found fewer than the same weeks a year earlier. The myth came later, from newspaper columns. The truth is slower and darker. As the Depression ground on, the national suicide rate rose year after year. Peaking in 1932, despair didn't come with the crash. It came with the third winter of unemployment, because the crash was only the trigger. The real catastrophe was the banks. Between 1930 and 1933, roughly 9,000 American banks failed. There was no FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance did not exist until 1933. Families who had never owned a single share of stock, who had done everything right, who had saved cash in a bank account, walked up to locked doors and read a paper notice saying their savings were gone. Depositors ultimately lost about $1.3 billion, the equivalent of tens of billions today, taken not by a market they'd gambled in, but by a system they'd trusted. And the Dow, it bottomed at 41 in July 1932, down 89%, and did not return to its 1929 peak until 1954, 25 years. If you were 40 when the market broke, you were 65 when it came back. By 1933, nearly 13 million Americans were out of work, 1 in 4. But statistics don't show you the shape of it. It looked like this. In 1933 alone, more than 200,000 farms were foreclosed. Across the whole Depression, roughly a third of American farmers lost land that had been in their families for generations. In Iowa, neighbors fought back with something called a penny auction. When the bank auctioned a foreclosed farm, Hundreds of farmers would show up, bid 1 penny, and stare down anyone who dared bid higher. Then they'd hand the farm back to its owner. In the cities, the evicted built shanty towns out of scrap wood, tar paper, and rusted car bodies, and they named them Hoovervilles, after the president. Seattle's Hoovervilles stretched for acres. A woman named Peggy Terry, who grew up in one in Oklahoma City, remembered families living in old car bodies and shacks made of orange crates, and the children left. At the height of the Depression, more than 250,000 teenagers were living on the road, riding freight trains from town to town, because one less mouth at the table was the only gift they could give their families. 15-year-olds alone, crossing the country in boxcars. The language of the streets recorded who Americans blamed. A newspaper you slept under was a Hoover blanket. An empty pocket turned inside out was a Hoover flag. A broken-down car pulled by a mule was a Hoover wagon. The president's name became a prefix for poverty, while he insisted, year after year, that relief was the job of churches and neighbors, not Washington. And the churches and neighbors tried. Soup kitchens stretched around city blocks, some of the most famous ones in Chicago, funded with no apparent irony by Al Capone. Charity did what it could. It was never close to enough. That is what losing everything meant. Not a number on a screen. A locked bank, an auctioned farm, a son on a freight train, and a country that hadn't built a single safety net to catch any of them. So how did they make it? Not with money. With 4 things that worked when money didn't. First, they built their own economies. When cash disappeared, towns printed their own. By early 1933, roughly 500,000 Americans were using local scrip, emergency currency issued by towns and companies. Atlantic City issued scrip you could use to pay your back taxes. In New Bedford, Massachusetts, 24 companies met payroll with $1, $2, and $5 scrip checks that circulated through town like real money. It worked because everyone agreed it worked, which, if you think about it, is all money has ever been. Second, they traded skills instead of dollars. In Seattle, the Unemployed Citizens League organized tens of thousands of people into a barter economy. Farmers gave food in exchange for labor. Carpenters fixed roofs for dentists. Seamstresses worked for firewood. No cash ever changed hands. Your skill was your bank account, and unlike a bank, nobody could close it. Third, they collapsed their households and swallowed their pride. 3 generations under one roof. Gardens in every yard. The boarder in the spare room. The suit worn until it shined. Pride was the first thing the Depression killed, and the people who let it die early did better than the ones who spent their savings keeping up appearances. The Vanderbilts, remember, did the opposite. And fourth, they held real things. The families who kept a few acres, a cow, tools, seed, things with no ticker symbol, always had a floor under them. A share certificate can go to 0. A potato field can't. One more pattern shows up in the oral histories, quieter than the others but just as constant. The people who fared best moved early and moved decisively. The family that took in boarders in 1930 instead of 1932. The man who took the job beneath him the month he lost his own, instead of waiting a year for his old life to come back. In a collapse, the cruelest tax is paid by those who spend their savings waiting for yesterday to return. The survivors grieved fast and adapted faster. And that, more than any asset, was the dividing line. Now the uncomfortable part. Because not everyone went down. A businessman named Floyd Odlum looked at the market euphoria in the summer of 1929 and did the hardest thing in investing. He sold. He sat on $14 million in cash, while his friends called him a fool. Then, after the crash, he spent 3 years buying ruined investment companies for pennies. By 1933, he was one of the 10 richest men in America. Perhaps the only man who built a great fortune out of the Depression itself. Joseph Kennedy, yes, that Kennedy, did the same, selling before the crash and selling short on the way down, and grew his fortune by more than $15 million while the country starved. I'm not telling you this to celebrate them. I'm telling you because of what it proves. The crash did not destroy money. It moved money from everyone who believed prices only go up to the few who refused to believe it. That transfer happens in every panic, in every century. The only question is which side of it you're standing on. There's one detail from the oral histories that explains the era better than any statistic: the shame. Decades later, when Studs Terkel interviewed survivors for his book, Hard Times, they spoke of unemployment the way people speak of a private sin. Men dressed every morning and left the house so the neighbors would think they still had jobs. Families starved quietly rather than be seen at the relief office. An entire generation had been raised to believe that failure was personal. So when the whole economy failed at once, millions of people each concluded privately that it was somehow their fault. The Depression's deepest damage was never on the balance sheets. It was in what people stopped believing about themselves. The Depression finally broke with the New Deal and the war economy. Deposit insurance arrived in 1933, too late for 9,000 banks worth of savers, but it has protected every American depositor since. The people who lived through it were marked for life. They saved compulsively. They distrusted debt. They kept cash in coffee cans and could not throw away a rubber band. We laughed at them gently for 50 years. Maybe we shouldn't have, because they knew something we keep forgetting. The system you trust with everything can lock its doors on a Tuesday morning. Here's the part that should make you sit up. Today, 37% of American adults could not cover a $400 emergency from savings. 18% couldn't cover $100. The personal saving rate in America is under 4%. The generation that survived 1929 would look at those numbers and recognize them instantly. They're the numbers of 1928. Nobody can tell you when the next panic comes. But 1929 already told you what survives one. Skills people need, neighbors you can trust, no debt you can't carry, and something real under your feet. The families who had those things lost everything and made it. The ones who had only paper lost everything and didn't. Every fortune ends the same way. The only question is how long it takes. Subscribe. The next story is already turning to dust.